Under the cold, relentless light of the operating room, Dr. Carlos Hernández's hands moved with a precision that bordered on the divine. Every incision, every suture was a testament to years of dedication to an art that challenged death itself. He was a maestro in a theater of life and death, where the rhythmic beeps of heart monitors composed the soundtrack to his daily miracles. In Houston, his name was synonymous with hope, a pillar of the medical community, known for his unshakable calm in the face of chaos. To his colleagues and patients, he was not just a cardiovascular surgeon, he was the wall that separated life from the abyss. Within those sterile walls, Carlos was a god in his own domain, a healer who dedicated his existence to mending the broken hearts of strangers, oblivious to the fact that his own was about to be irreparably shattered. That world of steel and antiseptics would dissolve the moment he walked through the door of his home. The scent of jasmine from the garden and the sound of his daughter Sophia's laughter replaced the hospital's tension. There, he wasn't the renowned Dr. Hernández, but simply Carlos, the husband, the father. This duality was the foundation of his happiness, a life built with the same care with which he performed his surgeries. Stories like his, of a man who seemed to have achieved everything, echo in so many corners of the world, making his fall all the more tragic. That is why I ask, before we delve into the darkness that awaits him, that you subscribe to our channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Comment what city you're watching from, as your presence helps us continue to bring impactful stories like this one. His wife, Elena, was the center of his universe, the architect of that domestic sanctuary. With a smile that could disarm any worry he brought home from work, she was the personification of grace and warmth. They met in college, she an art student, he a stubborn young man focused on medical textbooks. Elena saw beyond the ambition. She saw the kindness and the genuine desire to heal that moved him. Their love was a tapestry woven with simple moments, late dinners, whispered conversations in the dead of night, and a mutual understanding that transcended words. She was his safe harbor, the calm that balanced the constant storm of his profession. For Carlos, coming home was like docking in a safe pier after navigating a rough sea, and Elena was the lighthouse that always guided him back. And there was Sophia, little Sophia with her 7 years of age and an imagination that painted the world in vibrant colors. She was the masterpiece of their lives, the living proof of their love. Her drawings, filled with smiling suns and clumsy hearts, adorned the kitchen refrigerator like works of art in a sacred museum. Carlos cherished the memory of her little feet running through the house, the feeling of her thin arms around his neck when he came home, exhausted. He promised himself he would give her the world, a safe and protected world, far from the violence he had known in his own childhood. Sophia was his reason for being, the sweetest melody in his symphony of life, and every moment with her was a treasure he guarded with an almost religious devotion. This need to protect his family came from a deep, dark place in his past. Carlos grew up in a rough Houston neighborhood where police sirens were a lullaby and survival was a daily lesson. He saw up close how violence and despair could corrode the human soul, and medicine became his escape route, his form of rebellion. He didn't want to fight with fists, but with knowledge. Every life he saved was a personal victory against the chaos that had almost swallowed him. He had built a fortress of success and respectability around himself, believing that the walls of his suburban home and the prestige of his white coat could keep the shadows of his past at bay, a naive belief that fate would soon mock. Houston, for Carlos, was a city of two faces. There was the gleaming metropolis of glass skyscrapers and world-renowned medical centers, where he moved with confidence and purpose. This was the world he had conquered. But beneath this polished facade pulsed the other Houston, the city of dark alleys, of neighborhoods forgotten by progress, the place he had fought so hard to leave behind. He knew the language of the streets, the geography of fear, even if he tried to forget it. This contrast was a constant reminder of his journey, of the distance he had traveled. Little did he know that he would soon be forced to dive back into that underworld, not as a survivor, but as a hunter, using the darkness he so feared as his new ally. His best friend, Dr. David Chen, was one of the few people who knew fragments of his story of overcoming adversity. Colleagues on the hospital's front lines, they shared a friendship forged in long hours on call and the pressure of life or death decisions. David, with his dry humor and pragmatism, was the perfect counterpoint to Carlos's restrained intensity. They often met in the hospital cafeteria, and David noticed the weariness in his friend's eyes, but also the light that ignited whenever he spoke of Elena and Sofia. He was Carlos's moral compass, a constant reminder of the good man and healer he was. David worried, like a brother, but he could never have imagined the darkness that was about to consume his friend's soul. That night began like so. Many others, with an almost pictorial serenity. The family dinner, helping with Sofia's homework, and finally, the bedtime story. Carlos sat on the edge of his daughter's bed, his voice low and soothing as he read about distant kingdoms and brave heroes. Elena watched from the doorway, a tender smile on her lips. The air was imbued with a domestic peace, a sense of security so complete and absolute it seemed unbreakable. It was the last moment of normalcy, the last page of a happy chapter. As he kissed Sofia's forehead and turned off the light, leaving only a small nightlight on, Carlos felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude. He had everything. It was the silence before the storm, the calm that precedes total destruction, the final moment of a world that, in a few hours, would cease to exist forever. The silence of the early morning was desecrated by a sound that did not belong in that sanctuary of peace. The sharp shattering of glass downstairs sounded like a tear in the fabric of reality, a brutal noise that froze the blood in Carlos's veins. The stupor of sleep dissipated instantly, replaced by a primitive adrenaline and a paralyzing fear. Beside him, Eleanor woke up, panic stamped in her eyes in the dimness of the room. Every creak of the floorboards below was the step of approaching monsters, violating the sanctity of their home. The protective instinct, the most fundamental force of a father and husband, screamed inside him, but his hands, so skilled with a scalpel, trembled with a terrifying powerlessness. The world he had so painstakingly built was about to be demolished, and he was just a helpless spectator. With an urgent whisper, he pushed Elena and Sofia into the bedroom closet, a fragile refuge against the approaching storm. "Stay quiet no matter what happens," he pleaded, his heart hammering against his ribs. He went downstairs, his body tense, every muscle screaming in protest. The living room was in disarray, shadows dancing menacingly on the walls. There were three figures, masked and moving with a predatory familiarity. Their brutality was casual, their contempt for the lives of others palpable. Before them, Carlos was not the respected surgeon, but merely an obstacle. He saw the metallic glint of a gun in the leader's hand, a man whose presence radiated a cold, calculating cruelty. In that instant, the doctor who healed confronted the incurable disease of human evil. The violence that followed was a feverish nightmare, a blur of pain and terror that seared every second into his soul with a branding iron. He was subdued with humiliating ease, his body thrown to the floor like a rag doll. And then he heard the screams. The sounds that came from upstairs, the screams of his wife and daughter, were the soundtrack to his descent into hell. They were sounds that broke something fundamental within him, shattering his psyche irreparably. He fought, but it was useless. The assailants were swift, efficient, and inhuman. And then the silence, a deafening silence, more terrifying than any scream, that fell upon the house. They left him there, in a pool of his own blood, to drown in the quiet of a world that had just died. The days that followed were a fog of grief, bureaucracy, and a helpless anger that ate away at him from the inside. The police were respectful, but distant. The pitying looks from friends and colleagues were like salt in his open wounds. The investigation dragged on, a slow and frustrating process that seemed to mock the urgency of his pain. And then came the final blow, the ultimate betrayal of the system he once believed in. One of the suspects, captured weeks later, was released on a legal technicality, a procedural error that put him back on the streets. That news was the spark that ignited the fuel of his grief. Sadness gave way to a cold, crystalline fury. Justice wasn't blind. It was indifferent, flawed, and that failure had cost him everything. Alone in the now silent house, mausoleum of memories, Carlos stood before a photograph on the mantelpiece, Elena smiling, Sophia on his shoulders. He looked at his own hands, the same hands that had saved countless lives, that knew every artery and every nerve in the human body. A terrifying clarity took hold of him. If the laws of men were insufficient, he would turn to older, more immutable laws. The Hippocratic oath, which he had recited with such pride, crumbled to ash in his mind, replaced by a new vow, a silent, deadly oath. From that moment on, he decided he would no longer wait for a justice that would never come. He would seek it himself, and his hands, once instruments of healing, would become instruments of a precise, surgical, and relentless retribution. Carlos's grief did not manifest in tears, but in a silent, methodical metamorphosis. The spacious suburban house, now a mausoleum of echoes and ghosts, was sold. In its place, he chose a Spartan, anonymous apartment in a forgotten part of Houston, a place where no one would ask questions. The bare white walls were a reflection of his new existence. There, surrounded by the constant hum of the city that never sleeps, he began his true medical residency. Nights, once devoted to case studies and scientific articles, were now consumed by new research, mapping the structure of the gang that destroyed his world, learning their habits, their territories, and most importantly, their faces. He traded the oath to save lives for a promise to end them. The surgeon's body, accustomed to long hours on his feet but not to violence, needed to be remade. Carlos began a brutal and disciplined physical training regimen. The softness of his hands, once essential for the delicacy of his work, gave way to rough calluses. Pre-dawn runs through the city's most dangerous streets, exhaustive sessions in rundown boxing gyms, the physical pain serving as a welcome distraction from the agony of his soul. He learned to handle a firearm, not with the bravado of a criminal, but with the precision of an anatomist, studying trajectories and impact points with the same intensity with which he studied coronary arteries. He was becoming both the disease and the cure, the poison and the antidote. His tools of the trade changed drastically. The scalpel was replaced by the cold blade of a combat knife. Syringes, once used to administer life-saving anesthetics and drugs, were now filled with lethal cocktails, substances that could simulate heart failure or stroke, leaving a trail of seemingly natural deaths. His deep knowledge of the human body became his most terrifying weapon. He knew exactly where to press to incapacitate, where to cut to ensure there were no screams, how to exploit the biological frailties that exist in every human being. The persona of the surgeon was not just a nickname the police would come to give him. It was a literal description of his new, terrible art. The first target was a low-ranking member of the gang, a young man whose role on that fateful night had been as a lookout. Carlos tracked him for weeks, observing his monotonous and predictable routine. On the chosen night, as he followed him down a dimly lit alley, the doctor's heart pounded uncontrollably. Cold sweat dripped from his forehead, and the nausea of anticipation choked him. The ghost of who he once was, the man who had dedicated his life to preserving the flame of existence, waged a fierce battle against the Avenger being born. Every fiber of his being screamed against the act he was about to commit. For a paralyzing instant, he hesitated, the image of the Hippocratic oath flashing in his mind like a dying beacon. But then, Another image superimposed itself, stronger, more visceral. The terrified face of Elena, the last confused cry of Sophia. The hesitation evaporated, replaced by a wave of white-hot fury. The confrontation was clumsy, raw, nothing like the surgical precision he had imagined. It was a dirty, desperate struggle. The fear in the young man's eyes mirrored his own, but there was no turning back. When it was over, with the heavy silence falling over the alley, Carlos did not feel the relief of revenge. He felt an abyssal emptiness. The adrenaline gave way to a profound horror at what he had just done. He dragged himself away, his body trembling uncontrollably, and emptied his stomach into a trash can, the bitter taste of bile mingling with that of his own corrupted soul. The body was found the next morning, and the case landed on the desk of Detective Isabella Rossi, a woman of sharp intelligence and a tenacity that annoyed her superiors. Rossi was known for never letting a case go. She had grown up in the same kind of neighborhood as Carlos, but had chosen a different path to fight the chaos, the badge and the law. She was his antithesis, a fervent believer in the system he had come to despise. Upon arriving at the crime scene, she immediately sensed something was wrong. This wasn't a typical gangland murder, which was usually loud and chaotic. This had been quiet, contained, almost intimate in its brutality. She felt the presence of a controlling intelligence behind the act. As the forensics team worked, Rossi knelt beside the body, her mind cataloguing the inconsistencies. The cause of death, a single precise puncture in a vital spot, was not typical of a street fight. It lacked the uncontrolled rage. There was a coldness here, an efficiency that unsettled her. "Looks like our guy took an anatomy class," she muttered to her partner, who shrugged. But to Rossi, that detail was the key. It was the first time the word surgical came to mind. She didn't know it yet, but she had just taken the first step in a long and tortuous game of cat and mouse with a ghost who bled just as much as she did. Rossi's intuition led her to dive into the archives. She investigated the victim's life, his affiliation with the notorious Los Martillos gang, and his past crimes. It was then that she found the connection. The young man's name appeared in the preliminary reports of the brutal Hernández family murder investigation. That case had been an open wound for the department, a heinous crime that remained unsolved. Rossi felt a chill run down her spine. A coincidence? She didn't believe in coincidences. A thin line began to form in her mind, connecting the tragedy of the respected surgeon with the calculated death in the city's alleys. A reluctant empathy flickered for an instant. The unimaginable pain of Carlos, but it was quickly suppressed by her duty. The law was the law for everyone. As Rossi began to draw her map, Carlos was perfecting his methods. The mess of the first time would not be repeated. His second victim, another gang member identified from his files, met his end in a much more elegant manner. Using a syringe with an extremely fine needle, Carlos injected a calculated dose of potassium chloride into the man as he slept, inducing a fulminant cardiac arrest. To the medical examiner, it looked like an overdose or a sudden heart failure, common in the victim's lifestyle. It was a clean death, traceless, almost a phantom. Carlos felt a cold satisfaction with his own skill, a feeling that frightened him more than the violence of the first murder. The duality of his life became a form of torture. By day, he wore the white coat, walked the sterile hospital corridors, his steady hands saving a stranger's life on an operating table. By night, he wore the darkness, his hands becoming instruments of death. The strain of this double existence began to take its toll. He barely slept, his mind constantly planning, analyzing, hunting. Dr. David Chen, his friend, was the first to notice the drastic change. Carlos was thinner, his eyes sunken and haunted. The old camaraderie gave way to a distant silence. David tried to break through the barrier, inviting him to talk, but Carlos kept him at a distance, protecting his friend from the monstrous truth he had become. The second death, registered as not suspicious, would have gone unnoticed if not for Isabella Rossi's obsession. She didn't buy the story of natural causes. She pressed the medical examiner, pointed out the victim's connection to the first one and to the Hernández case. Slowly, a terrifying pattern began to emerge on her investigation board. Two members of the same gang, both linked to a specific crime, dead in discreet and efficient ways. The vigilante theory, once a whisper, was now a concrete working hypothesis. The media knew nothing yet, but Rossi felt she was on the trail of something big, a kind of dark, twisted justice operating in the shadows of her city. For Carlos, the initial mission of revenge began to transform. The original list of his family's killers was still the main objective, but his vision expanded. As he delved into the underworld, he saw the rot everywhere, dealers selling poison to children, abusers terrorizing communities, murderers escaping. Through legal loopholes, a distorted savior complex began to form in his mind. He wasn't just getting revenge, he was cleansing the city, performing a radical surgery on the diseased body of society. He was the only one with the courage and the skills to cut out the cancer that the justice system proved unable or unwilling to remove. His next move had to be a statement. He aimed higher up the gang's hierarchy, a sadistic lieutenant of El Martillo, known for his brutality and for being untouchable. Eliminating this man would not just be another act of revenge, but a direct message to the gang leader. It was a calculated risk, a deliberate escalation that would put him directly in the crosshairs of the entire criminal organization. He knew that after this death, there would be no more hiding in the shadows. It would be the beginning of an open war, and he was ready to fight it. The preparation for this attack was different, more focused, devoid of any hesitation. The doctor was being buried deeper and deeper. There is a point in certain journeys from which there is no return. It is not the first step, often taken in the confusion of pain or anger, but the conscious step toward the abyss, with eyes wide open. Carlos stood before that precipice, about to take that step. This is the moment that defines not the beginning of the fall, but the acceptance of it. And if you feel the weight of this decision, if you understand that some roads, once taken, must be traveled to their bitter end, I ask that you subscribe to our channel. Your support is what allows us to continue narrating these descents into darkness, showing them in all their complexity until their inevitable conclusion. The attack on the lieutenant was bold and precise. Carlos intercepted his convoy on an industrial bridge, using the darkness and the element of surprise to his advantage. The action was swift, brutal, and ended with the lieutenant isolated. In the final confrontation, Carlos used no poison or tricks. He used direct violence, looking into the eyes of the man who helped orchestrate his family's death. And before leaving, he left his signature, a small, complex surgical suture knot, tied with a thread from the victim's own coat, left visibly on his chest. It was a symbol, a clear message to those who would understand. The surgeon was operating, and his precision was deadly. The news of the lieutenant's death exploded like a bomb in Houston's underworld. El Martillo, the sadistic and charismatic gang leader who ruled his empire with a mix of fear and forced loyalty, was enraged. The death of his right-hand man was not just an operational loss, it was a public humiliation, a direct challenge to his authority. From within his fortress, he declared war. A generous bounty was placed on the head of the mysterious killer, described only as the surgeon. The order was clear: find him, bring him back alive, so that El Martillo could dismember him personally. The city became a hunting ground, and Carlos was the prey. Suddenly the game had turned. Carlos, who had grown accustomed to being the hunter, now felt the weight of being hunted. The streets he used as his hunting grounds were now filled with eyes looking for him. Gang members, informants, hired killers, all wanting a piece of the bounty. He had to become even more of a ghost, constantly changing his patterns, using his knowledge of the city to move through forgotten passages and rooftops. The pressure was relentless. Every face in the crowd was a potential threat. Every distant siren made his heart race. The loneliness of his mission was now accompanied by a constant, draining paranoia. The inevitable close call came on a rainy night. A trap, simple but effective, had been set in a place he used to frequent to observe his targets. He sensed something was wrong too late. The confrontation was quick and violent. It was 4 against 1. He managed to escape, using the darkness and confusion to his advantage, but not without a price. A knife slashed his arm, and a bullet grazed his rib. Wounded and bleeding, he limped through the drenched streets, the physical pain an anchor for his racing mind. He was not invincible. He was flesh and blood, and his solitary war could very well kill him. Back in his sterile apartment, the scene was a grotesque parody of his former life. With the lights off, except for a small desk lamp, he removed his own shirt and examined his wounds. The kitchen counter became his operating table. With a bottle of whiskey as an antiseptic and a suture kit he had stolen from the hospital, he cleaned and stitched his own arm. The pain was excruciating, but his hands remained steady, guided by years of practice. He was the doctor and the patient, the one who caused the wound and the one who healed it. In that moment, the solitude of his crusade had never seemed so absolute and desolate. The psychological toll of his actions began to manifest in terrifying ways. Sleep brought no rest, only nightmares. He relived his family's death night after night, but now the scenes were mixed with the faces of the men he had killed. Their eyes accused him in the dark. During the day at the hospital, the tension was almost unbearable. As he looked down at a patient on the operating table, he would see the face of one of his victims. The line between savior and killer was blurring completely, and he feared the man he saw in the mirror, a stranger with cold, empty eyes. Dr. David Chen could no longer stand the silence. He cornered Carlos in an empty break room at the hospital, concern etched on his face. "Carlos, look at you. You look like a ghost. You don't talk. You barely eat. I'm your friend. For God's sake, tell me what's happening to you," he pleaded, his voice full of genuine anguish. Carlos just stared at him, the mask of coldness firmly in place. He wanted to tell him, wanted to unburden himself, but how could he confess to his best friend, a man dedicated to life, that he had become a reaper? "I'm fine, David, just tired," he lied, and the lie sounded hollow even to his own ears, creating an even greater chasm between them. Meanwhile, Detective Rossi finally got a solid lead. A homeless man, who had hidden during the attack on the lieutenant, came forward, coerced by a street cop he knew. The description was vague. A man of average height who moved quickly and confidently, his face obscured by shadows. But he mentioned a crucial detail. The man appeared to be injured in the arm as he fled. Rossi connected this to the forensics, which indicated one of the victims might have managed to wound the attacker. She now had a focus: to search hospitals and clinics for someone with an unreported knife wound. She was getting closer. Carlos's war forced him to dive even deeper into the underworld's communication networks. He used his technical skills to intercept messages, monitoring the gang's movements in their hunt for him. That's how he discovered the information he had so desperately sought. An encrypted communication revealed a high-level meeting El Martillo would be having in 2 days, at a location that made Carlos's heart stop. An old, abandoned chapel on the outskirts of the city, a place notorious for being the gang's private slaughterhouse. It was a fortress. To invade it would be suicide. But that was where his final target would be. The journey was reaching its bloody climax. The last 48 hours were a ritual of preparation. Carlos cleaned his weapons, organized his makeshift medical gear, and studied the blueprints of the abandoned chapel. There was no more anger, only a cold calm and a sense of final purpose. Revenge which had once been a consuming fire, was now just the final task on a long, exhaustive list of procedures. He looked at himself in the mirror one last time. The face, staring back, was not that of Dr. Carlos Hernández, the loving husband, the devoted father, the brilliant surgeon. That man had died with his family. The reflection showed only the surgeon, a gaunt and somber figure, an instrument of death ready for his final operation. The abandoned chapel stood against the night sky like a skeleton, a monument to neglect and desecration. The fine rain that fell seemed to weep over the broken stained-glass windows and graffitied walls. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and gunpowder. Carlos moved through the shadows with the fluidity of a predator, every step silent, every breath controlled. He was no longer the hesitant doctor from the first murder. He was a force of nature, a spectre driven by a singular purpose. The sentries positioned around the perimeter were neutralized with brutal, silent efficiency. One by one, their lives extinguished before they could make a sound. He was death, arriving on tiptoe, a surgeon preparing for the final incision on a malignant tumor. He reached the entrance of the main nave, the pulsating heart of El Martillo's operation. Inside, under the flickering light of a single work lamp hanging from the ceiling, the gang leader stood before the broken stone altar, using it as a makeshift table to count money and weapons. He gestured and laughed with his most trusted lieutenants, his arrogance filling the sacred space like a blasphemy. To them, this place was just another hideout. To Carlos, it was the perfect stage for the final act of his tragedy. Hidden by a stone pillar, he watched the scene, his heart beating to a cold, steady rhythm. The calm that preceded him was not peace, but the focused silence before a complex and irreversible procedure. Instead of a surprise attack, Carlos chose words as his first weapon. He stepped out of the shadows, his figure silhouetted against the darkness, and his voice, low but laden with an unbearable weight, cut through the conversation. "Do you remember my face?" The group turned abruptly, hands instinctively going for their weapons. El Martillo, however, raised a hand to stop them, a sneer forming on his lips. He didn't recognize Carlos, seeing only a foolish, lone man who had signed his own death warrant. "Should I?" he mocked, his eyes gleaming with a cruel amusement. "I see so many faces. Most of them I forget after they beg for their lives. Yours will be one of them." "My wife's name was Elena. My daughter, Sophia," Carlos said, taking another step into the light. And then recognition flashed in El Martillo's eyes. The smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by genuine surprise, which soon twisted into a sadistic pleasure. "Ah, yes. The doctor," he said, savoring the word. "Your wife. She was loud, had fight in her. The girl, not so much." Every word was a stab, calculated to break Carlos's spirit, but he underestimated the depth of his opponent's transformation. The pain didn't break Carlos. It forged him into something harder than steel. The last ember of the compassionate doctor was extinguished forever, leaving only the coldness of the surgeon. At the exact moment El Martillo signaled for his men to attack, the chapel's double doors burst inward. Blinding floodlights inundated the interior, rendering the shadows useless. "Houston PD! Hands in the air! Drop your weapons!" The amplified voice of Isabella Rossi echoed off the stone walls. She was there, in a bulletproof vest, weapon drawn, flanked by a SWAT team in full tactical gear. The scene froze in a breathtaking standoff. The gang members were trapped between the lone avenger and the force of the law. El Martillo was cornered, and Carlos, the target of two separate hunts, found himself at the center of it all. Rossi's voice cut through the tension again, this time directed only at him, softer, almost a plea. "Dr. Hernández, Carlos, it's over. Look at yourself. Don't become the monster you've been hunting. Let the law handle it now." Her words were a bridge to the world he had abandoned, a chance at redemption. El Martillo, seeing an opportunity in the chaos, began to move slowly to the side, a mocking smile on his face. He believed the system would protect him again. Carlos stood on a knife's edge, revenge and certain damnation on one side, surrender and the possibility of his enemy escaping true justice on the other. The weight of his entire journey came down to the decision of that single second. He chose neither of the options offered to him. In a fluid, explosive movement, ignoring Rossi's screams and the gunshots that began to echo, he didn't shoot. He lunged at El Martillo. In his hand was not a gun, but the silver glint of a surgical scalpel, his most familiar tool. The movement was terrifyingly precise, a direct and fatal strike to the subclavian artery, at the exact point below the collarbone. A blow he knew would cause a massive, uncontrollable hemorrhage. It was the final act, the perfect, horrific fusion of the doctor and the killer. As El Martillo fell, choking on his own blood, the chapel erupted in a pandemonium of gunfire. Carlos's fate was sealed not by a bullet, but by his own hand in his final act of surgery. When the last echo of gunfire dissipated in the desecrated chapel, a heavy silence settled, broken only by the dripping of rain through the hole-ridden roof. The gunpowder smoke hung in the air like a ghostly fog. El Martillo lay motionless near the altar, his life drained away by the surgeon's precise blow. A few feet away, leaning against the cold stone, was Carlos Hernández. Multiple red stains spread across his chest and abdomen. He made no move to fight or flee as Detective Rossi cautiously approached, her gun still raised but with a visible hesitation. In Carlos's eyes, there was no anger or fear, only a deep, exhausted emptiness. The procedure was finished, the patient was dead, and the surgeon, finally, could rest. He survived, but the life that remained was merely a shadow of existence. The same hands that had once performed heart transplants were now handcuffed to a hospital bed under the watchful eye of armed guards. The world around him, the beeping of monitors, the smell of antiseptic, was a cruel mockery of all he had been. He refused to speak during his interrogation and trial, his defense an unbreakable silence. He had won his war, annihilated everyone responsible for his family's destruction, but the victory rang hollow in the courtroom. He had excised the tumor that afflicted him, but in the process, the surgery had also removed his soul, leaving only the shell of a man that the justice of men now claimed. The story of the vigilante doctor set Houston ablaze, dividing the city. To law and order, he was a monster, a serial killer who placed himself above all morality. To the countless citizens who felt abandoned and terrorized by rising crime, he became a folk hero, an avenging angel born from the failure of the system. His picture was in every newspaper, the face of a good man, twisted by tragedy. Heated debates about justice, revenge, and what happens when a man loses everything took over the airwaves. Carlos Hernández, in his silence, became an urban legend, a dark symbol of the price of pain and the thin line that separates civilization from chaos. Years later, Detective Isabella Rossi, now a captain, would sometimes open the Hernández case file, kept in her office. The photos, the reports, the scalpel tagged as evidence. She had caught the killer, but she never felt the taste of victory. She saw only the tragedy in its entirety, a system that failed to protect a family, that failed to punish the guilty, and that ultimately created the very monster it was forced to hunt. The question that haunted her, and that Carlos's story left for everyone, remained unanswered. Was he a villain to be condemned, or a symptom of a deeper social disease? Or was he simply the terrifying proof that inside every good man there is a breaking point? The legacy of Carlos. Hernández was not one of heroism or villainy, but a chilling reminder of the fragility of the human soul. His dark journey forces us to look into the abyss, to question what we would do if our own lives were shattered in the same way. Stories like his, which explore the darkest corners of pain and retribution, need to be told. That is why your support is so crucial. Subscribing to our channel allows us to continue bringing these complex narratives to light and to reflect on the questions they raise. We thank you for joining us on this journey. Every comment, every subscription gives us the strength to move forward, ensuring that these voices are not lost in the silence.